My name is Rick Holloway, and the moment my life split in two happened on a video call I thought would last less than a minute. I tapped the screen from my kitchen in suburban Columbus, Ohio, expecting to see my son Adam's familiar face, maybe a smile, maybe some nervous excitement, as I asked him when the wedding would be so I could mark the date and finally feel included. The screen lit up, but Adam didn't speak. Natalie was the one looking back at me, sitting close beside him. Her posture relaxed, her expression almost practiced. When I asked the question, she didn't hesitate. She leaned a little closer to the camera and said they had already gotten married. Yesterday. For a second I thought the call had glitched, that the audio was out of sync with reality, so I asked her to repeat it. She did slowly, and then added the part that still tightens my chest. They only invited people who were really close. I watched Adam's eyes drop away from the screen, while Natalie shifted comfortably on the couch I had helped pay for. And I felt the phone grow heavy in my hand, as if it carried a weight I hadn't agreed to lift. I stood there staring at my own reflection in the small corner of the screen, realizing I was seeing myself as they now saw me, optional, unnecessary, already written out. What Natalie didn't say, but counted on me remembering, was everything that had come before: the rent I covered when paychecks came late, the insurance I paid when cards expired, the quiet belief that helping without keeping score was what made a father matter. I didn't know yet that this video call was not the end of my place in their story, but the beginning of a much darker chapter 1, where being excluded from a wedding would turn into a fight to prove I still had the right to run my own life. The afternoon was quiet in the way only a lived-in house can be quiet. Not empty, just settled. Sunlight filtered through the blinds and stopped halfway across the living room carpet, right where my wife used to complain it faded the fabric. I stood in the kitchen of my home in suburban Columbus, Ohio, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, watching a squirrel balance along the top of the wooden fence in my backyard. I had tried calling my son earlier that morning. It rang until voicemail like it had a few times lately. I did not think much of it then. People get busy. Life moves faster when you are young. By the afternoon, I figured I would try again. Not to ask for anything complicated. Just one simple question. When is the wedding? That was it. I wanted to circle a date on the calendar, maybe book a hotel downtown, maybe take my suit to the cleaner, and hope the years had not shrunk it. I told myself it was the kind of call a father was supposed to make. Nothing more. I scrolled to Adam's name and hit call. It rang twice and then someone picked up. It was not Adam. It was his wife. Or at least the woman I still thought of as his future wife at that moment. Her voice came through the speaker calm and steady, like she had been expecting a call from someone, maybe not me, but someone. I told her it was Rick. I said I hoped I was not calling at a bad time. I explained that I was just checking in, trying to find out when the wedding was scheduled so I could plan ahead. There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough to notice. Then she told me in the same even tone that they had already gotten married. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard her. The kitchen clock ticked louder than it should have. I asked her to repeat herself, not because I needed confirmation, but because my mind had not caught up with the sentence yet. She repeated it. They had already gotten married. I leaned against the counter and stared at the wall above the sink, where a small crack ran down from the cabinet, something I had meant to fix for years. I did not say anything right away. I could feel my grip tightening on the phone. She kept talking, filling the silence. She said it had been small, very private, just a courthouse thing. She said they only invited people who were really close to them. Really close. The words stayed with me longer than anything else she said. They were not sharp. They were not meant to wound. That was what made them worse. They sounded decided, final. I did not argue. I did not ask who had been there. I did not ask why I was not. I congratulated them because that felt like the only acceptable response left to me. I told her I hoped it had been a beautiful day. She thanked me. We ended the call. The line went dead, and the house seemed to pull back a little, like it was giving me space I had not asked for. I set the phone down and noticed my hand was shaking just slightly. Not the shaking that comes with anger. This was something quieter, colder. I poured the coffee down the drain, rinsed the mug, and placed it upside down on the towel, the way my wife used to prefer. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the water run. That night, after a dinner I barely tasted, I sat on the couch with my laptop. I told myself I was just checking the news. That was the lie I used. My fingers knew better. They typed my son's name into the search bar without asking permission. The photos loaded quickly. It was exactly what she had said. A small courthouse ceremony, fluorescent lights, a bouquet that looked like it came from the grocery store down the road. Adam standing beside her, smiling in that careful way he does when he is not sure what is expected of him. Her parents were there, her sister, a few friends whose faces I recognized from old holiday cards. Everyone was pressed close, shoulders touching, arms linked. They looked comfortable, included. I clicked through every picture. I was not in any of them. Neither was my sister Margaret. There was no gap where we might have stood. No empty space suggesting an oversight. This was not something that slipped through the cracks. This was planned. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I tried to build a reasonable explanation. Maybe they thought I would not want to travel. Maybe Adam assumed I was busy. Maybe they planned to tell me later face to face like it was something to soften the blow. None of those explanations fit the calm certainty in her voice on the phone. I thought about the day my wife died 8 years earlier. How Adam had stood in this same living room, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. How I had told him without hesitation that no matter what happened next, I would always be there for him. I meant it then, I still do. What I did not understand was that being there did not guarantee you a place. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark as the house settled around me. A car passed outside, headlights sliding briefly across the wall. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and went quiet. I found myself thinking about the word close. I turned it over in my head, measuring it against memories I had never questioned before. Teaching Adam how to drive in an empty parking lot. Sitting through his college orientation while pretending not to be overwhelmed. Helping him move into his first apartment, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs without complaining. At what point had that stopped counting? I did not feel angry yet. Anger requires energy, and all I felt was a weight pressing down slowly, like something settling where it intended to stay. I stood up and walked to the bedroom closet. My suit hung there still in its garment bag, untouched. I had imagined wearing it, standing somewhere off to the side watching my son start his new life. I zipped the bag closed without taking the suit out. If I was not close enough to be there on the day my son chose his future, then I needed to understand what that meant. Not just for him, for me. I turned off the light and let the room go dark, holding on to that question, knowing it was not finished with me yet. I slept poorly that night, the kind of sleep where your body rests, but your mind keeps pacing. When morning came, it did not bring clarity. It brought routine. I made coffee. I opened the blinds. I listened to the house wake up around me. By mid-morning, the question I had carried into the dark, was still there, heavier now that daylight made it harder to ignore. I went to the small desk in the corner of the dining room and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a folder I had not organized in years. It held bank statements, insurance notices, receipts I never filed properly. Practical things, familiar things. I told myself I was just cleaning up. That was the excuse. The truth was simpler. I needed something solid to hold on to. Claire died in 2016, and nothing has felt properly anchored since. The days after the funeral blurred together. People meant well. They brought food. They hugged me too long. Then they went back to their lives, and I stayed. I learned how to make meals for one, how to sleep on one side of the bed, how to hear silence without mistaking it for peace. Adam was 28 then. He told me he was doing fine. He always said that. He had a job that sounded promising when he described it, something in logistics, something with growth. He moved once, then again, chasing opportunity. Every move came with optimism and a reason it would be different this time. That was also when Natalie entered the picture for good. She was polite at first. Very polite. She asked about my health. She smiled when I talked about Claire. The first time she called me by my first name instead of sir, she laughed like she had crossed an invisible line. I remember thinking she was confident, comfortable taking up space. The first time Adam asked for help, it felt like nothing. He called late one evening, voice tight, saying his paycheck had been delayed. Rent was due in the morning. He said he hated asking. I believed him. I told him it was fine and transferred the money while he was still on the line. He thanked me quickly, relief spilling out before he hung up. A month later, it was the car insurance. Natalie had been pulled over. The card in the glove compartment was expired. Adam sounded embarrassed again. He explained it carefully, like he had rehearsed. I sent the money. There was no moment where I said yes to everything. It happened in increments. A tire blew out on the highway. A mechanic said the transmission could not wait. Natalie needed a medical visit, and the copay was higher than expected. Adam said things were tight for just a couple weeks. Just a couple weeks became a familiar phrase. I did not keep score. I did not write anything down. I never told myself this was a pattern. I told myself this was what families did. Claire and I had planned well. We paid off the mortgage early. We saved. I retired without fear of missing a meal. Helping my son did not feel like sacrifice. It felt like continuity. Natalie grew more comfortable with it than Adam did. Sometimes she was the one who called. Not to ask outright, but to explain a situation. She spoke quickly, confidently, as if the problem was already half solved. Adam would come on the line later, quieter, confirming what she had said. Thank you always came, but it never sounded finished. It sounded like a pause between needs. As the years passed, my father started showing up in my thoughts more often. Frank Holloway was not a harsh man, but he was firm in ways that stayed with you. When I was 19 and short on cash, I once asked him for money to cover a mistake I had made. He listened, nodded, and then handed me the phone number of a second shift supervisor at the plant. He told me a man stands on his own feet even when someone is willing to lift him. He said help is meant to get you moving, not keep you comfortable. At the time, I thought he was being cold. Later, I understood he was being careful. When Adam called with problems, I told myself I was giving him a rope. I did not consider that I might be building something softer underneath him. That morning, I spread the statements out on the table. 1 month at a time. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Rent assistance that started as a one-time thing and quietly repeated. Car repairs that should have ended the problem, followed by another repair, then another. I found an envelope from 2019 with a note in my own handwriting reminding me I had covered an emergency room copay. I did the math on a legal pad the way I always do, slowly, carefully. Over 5 years, it came to a little over $31,000. A number big enough to matter, spread out enough that I had never felt it all at once. What unsettled me was not the total. It was what never appeared alongside it. At no point did Adam call to say he was back on his feet. At no point did he say he no longer needed help. There was no finish line. Every thank you was followed by another explanation weeks later. Every promise of stability came with conditions, and I saw my own role more clearly than I liked. I had never asked him to make a plan. I had never said this is the last time. I had never required him to stand without me nearby. I told myself I was protecting him. The truth was harder. I was afraid that if I stopped helping, I would stop being needed. I sat there with the legal pad in front of me, the numbers staring back like they had been waiting years to be acknowledged. $31,000 did not earn a seat at a courthouse ceremony. It did not earn a phone call before vows were exchanged. It did not earn closeness. I opened my banking app and scrolled through the list of scheduled transfers. One entry stopped me. A recurring payment I barely remembered setting up, so routine it had become invisible. My finger hovered over the screen. From the living room came the faint tick of the wall clock. The same one Claire bought because she liked how quiet it was. A thought settled in, unwelcome but steady. Maybe my kindness had not protected my son. Maybe it had delayed him. My phone vibrated softly on the table. I glanced down and saw Margaret's name light up the screen. I did not answer right away. I looked back at the numbers, at the transfer, at the choice sitting in front of me. Outside, the morning moved on as if nothing was changing. Inside, something already had. I let the phone buzz on the table for a moment before picking it up. Not because I was busy, but because I had started to measure time differently. A few seconds of silence felt earned now. It was my sister, Margaret. She did not ask how I was. She asked if I had heard from Adam. I said I had, sort of. The word came out vague on purpose. There was a pause on her end, the kind that told me she already knew something and was deciding how gently to step into it. Then she asked when the wedding had been. I felt my chest tighten. I looked at the dining table where the bank statements were still stacked, neat and accusing. I asked her why she was asking. Because I saw pictures, she said. Not from you, from a woman at church. Her niece knows Natalie's sister. That is how it came up. I closed my eyes. The room felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in to listen. I told her the truth. I said it had already happened. I said it had been small. I said I was not invited. Margaret went quiet. Then she asked if I was sure. Not because she doubted me, but because she wanted the possibility of a mistake to exist a little longer. I told her I was sure. What did they say? She asked. I hesitated. I did not want to repeat the phrase, but it was already living in my head. I told her Natalie said they only invited people who were really close. Margaret exhaled slowly. She did not raise her voice. She did not curse. She said she was sorry. Then she said something that landed heavier than anything else. Rick, she said, you have been close enough to pay their bills for years. It was not an accusation. It was a fact. That made it worse. I told her I did not want to talk about money. Not yet. She softened immediately. She said she understood. She said she just did not want me pretending this was normal when it clearly was not. She told me she loved me and said she would call again soon. After the call ended, the house went quiet in a different way. This was not the calm quiet of a Sunday afternoon. This was the kind of quiet that made every sound feel too loud. The days that followed were uneventful on the surface. That was what made them hard. Adam sent a text 2 days later. "Hope you are doing okay." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I typed a response, erased it, typed another. In the end, I wrote that I was fine and that I hoped he was happy. I did not mention the wedding. I did not ask a question. I pressed send. He replied with a thumbs up. That was it. A week passed, then another. I tried calling him once on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of time when families usually check in. It rang until voicemail. I did not leave a message. I did not want my voice sitting there waiting to be ignored. Natalie did not reach out at all. Life kept placing reminders in front of me, small and uninvited. A restaurant where Adam and I used to meet for lunch when he worked downtown. The hardware store where I bought him a tool set after college, telling him every man should own his own tools. The back corner of my garage where a dusty box still held his old baseball glove and a few trophies I never had the heart to throw away. Those things felt heavier now, like artifacts from a story that had already ended. One afternoon, I went to the grocery store because my refrigerator was empty and I was out of reasons to avoid it. The place was busy in the way it always is, bright lights, carts squeaking, the smell of bread near the entrance. I was picking through apples when I heard my name. Rick. I turned and saw Denise Harper, someone I had known for years through neighborhood events and mutual friends. She smiled warmly, a toddler perched in the front of her cart. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. "How have you been? How is retirement? Can you believe how expensive everything is now?" Her eyes flicked over my face, searching for something she had already heard about. Then she asked about Adam. "How is the newlywed doing?" she said. The word landed hard. Newlywed. I forced a smile and repeated it as if saying it aloud would buy me time. Denise nodded, cheerful. "Yes. I saw the pictures. Such a sweet ceremony." Natalie looked beautiful. I could have lied. I could have said it was lovely. I could have nodded and moved on. Instead, I looked down at the apples in my hand and said I was glad they were happy. Denise tilted her head. "Were you able to make it?" The aisle seemed to narrow. I could hear a cart roll past behind me, the hum of the coolers, the toddler babbling. All of it felt very far away. I said no. I said it was small, and they kept it limited. Denise's smile faltered just enough to be noticeable. She murmured something about young couples and their preferences, then quickly changed the subject. She mentioned a new bakery item and said she needed to keep moving. We said goodbye. She walked away. I stood there for a moment, holding apples I no longer wanted, feeling something settle in my chest that was not just sadness. It was the realization that I was being written out of my own family story, not only in private, but in public. People were seeing pictures. They were filling in blanks. And the version of me they saw was a father who did not show up. On the drive home, I kept both hands on the steering wheel. I passed houses with wedding signs still hanging on front doors, congratulations fading in the sun. I wondered how many fathers drove home feeling proud and how many drove home feeling erased. When I walked into my house, the quiet felt different, not peaceful, instructive. I sat at the dining table again. My phone was face up beside me. No new messages. No missed calls. I scrolled through an old thread with Adam and deleted it. Not out of anger, out of necessity. I needed to stop rereading a version of our relationship that no longer existed. The truth settled in slowly and then all at once. If I did not draw a line, the silence would not break on its own. It would stretch week after week until it became the permanent shape of things. And once silence becomes permanent, it stops feeling like something you can change. It starts feeling like something you agreed to. Agreed to was a dangerous word. It implied consent. It implied I had looked at the shape of my life and nodded. I woke up the next morning with that thought still sitting on my chest. The air outside was cold and clean, the kind of Ohio morning that makes everything look sharper than it feels. I made coffee and stood by the window watching a school bus stop at the corner, kids spilling out like birds. Ordinary life. People moving forward. And me stuck in a question I did not ask for. I did not make the decision to stop helping in a single moment. It came after several nights of staring at the ceiling, replaying Natalie's calm voice in my head. We only invited people who were really close. It came after the grocery store aisle, after Denise's polite confusion, after the quiet shame that followed me back to my car. It came after I deleted my old messages with Adam and realized how easily a relationship can become a record of one person reaching and the other person responding only when convenient. I sat down at the dining table again, the same place where I had run the numbers. My phone was face up, silent. My laptop was open. I logged into my bank account. There it was, sitting in the list of scheduled transfers like it belonged there. A recurring payment that went out automatically each month, the kind of thing you set up once and then stop noticing. I stared at it for a long time, not because I did not know what to do, but because I did. I thought about calling Adam first. I pictured him answering, distracted, maybe trying to sound upbeat. I pictured myself explaining my feelings, trying to be reasonable, trying to ask for something as simple as respect. I pictured him saying he understood, and then doing nothing differently. Then I pictured Natalie listening in the background. I pictured her taking the phone from him, speaking in that calm, finished tone. I did not want to negotiate my dignity. So I did the simplest thing. I clicked the transfer. I hit cancel. The site asked if I was sure. I clicked yes. It was so quiet I almost expected a sound like a door closing in another part of the house. Nothing happened. The screen refreshed. The transfer was gone. I sat there, hands on the table, waiting to feel triumph. I did not. What I felt was a strange kind of calm, the way you feel after you finally say no to something you have been saying yes to for too long. I did not tell anyone. I did not send a message. I did not announce it. I went about my day like a man who had simply paid a bill. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Adam. I watched the screen for a second before answering. When I picked up, I kept my voice even. I said hello the way I always did. He did not waste time. He asked if everything was okay. I told him I was fine. I asked him if he was. There was a pause, then his voice tightened just slightly. He said he noticed the transfer did not go through. He said he thought maybe the bank had an issue. He said he was just checking. I could hear him choosing words, trying to keep it casual, trying to make it sound like a small administrative error. That told me more than his question did. I said it was not an error. I told him I had canceled it. He went quiet. I could almost picture him standing somewhere with his hand covering the phone, looking over at Natalie, waiting for instruction. He asked why. I did not raise my voice. I did not list grievances. I said I needed to simplify things on my end. I said I was tightening my budget. I said I could not keep sending money automatically anymore. He said he understood, but his voice did not match the words. He asked if we could talk about it. He asked if I could at least help for a month or two until they figured something out. I asked him what the plan was. He hesitated. He said work had been unpredictable. He said expenses had come up. He said they were managing, but it was tight. I told him I believed he could manage. I told him he was a grown man. I told him I loved him. Then I told him the transfer was staying cancelled. He swallowed, or at least it sounded like he did. He said, "Okay." He said he would call me later. The line went dead. I sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet that followed, and realized something that made my stomach turn. In the first 10 seconds of that call, he had not asked about me. Not really. He had asked about the money. An hour after that, a text came in from Natalie. Her message was polite on the surface. She said she hoped I was doing well. She said Adam mentioned I had canceled the help. She said she understood everyone has to make choices. Then she added that family has always supported each other, and that it was important to show up for the people you love in difficult seasons. Show up. I read that line 3 times. The words were ordinary. The meaning was not. I responded carefully. I said I wished them the best. I said I was focusing on my own stability now. I did not argue. I did not mention the wedding. I refused to step into the frame she was trying to put around me. Her reply came quickly. She said she was disappointed. She said she did not expect this from me. She said Adam was hurting. Then she wrote that they had responsibilities now, and it was unfair to pull support without warning. Without warning. I stared at the screen and felt a low heat rise in my chest. Not the heat of rage, the heat of clarity. She was speaking as if the support was a contract, as if I had made a promise I was obligated to keep, as if my role in their life was defined by my usefulness. I did not answer. Later that afternoon, I drove to my bank. It was a small branch in a strip mall, the kind with posters about retirement planning, and a bowl of cheap pens on the counter. I had been going there for years. Familiar faces, familiar greetings. I told myself I was just checking something routine. Mary O'Donnell was there, the branch manager, a woman around my age with steady eyes and a calm way of speaking. She recognized me immediately and asked if I had a minute. Her tone was friendly, but there was a seriousness beneath it. She led me to her office and closed the door. She asked how I was doing. I gave the usual answer. Fine. Hanging in there. She nodded like she had heard that answer from men like me before. Then she told me something that made the room feel colder. She said there had been a couple of inquiries on my accounts recently. Not withdrawals. Not fraud in the way people picture it. Requests for information. Questions about access. Attempts to confirm details that someone should not be trying to confirm unless they had plans. I asked who made the inquiries. Mary said she could not give me every detail, but she could tell me the inquiries were connected to someone claiming to be helping manage my affairs. She said the wording was careful. She said it was the kind of thing she had seen when families start positioning themselves around an older relative's finances. I felt my mouth go dry. I asked if my money was safe. Mary said my money was safe for now. She said the bigger issue was access. She said if someone got the right paperwork, the right signatures, the right story, things could change quickly. She asked if I had signed anything recently. She asked if I had agreed to anyone handling my accounts. I thought about the paper Natalie tried to put in front of me. I thought about how close I had come to treating it like nothing. I told Mary I had not signed anything. I told her I did not want anyone managing my affairs. She nodded and slid a form across the desk. She said we should put extra protections in place. She said I should consider updating my beneficiaries and tightening security. She said it might be wise to speak with an attorney just to understand what someone could try to do. When I left the bank, the sun was already lowering. The parking lot was busy. People loading groceries, climbing into cars, living their ordinary lives. I sat behind the wheel and looked at my hands resting on the steering wheel, and I realized I was no longer dealing with hurt feelings. I was dealing with intent. On the drive home, my phone stayed silent. No call from Adam. No apology. No explanation. Just the quiet. The same quiet that had been shaping my life. Only now it felt like something else was moving underneath it. Something patient and calculating. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew I had drawn a line. I just did not know yet how hard they were going to push back against it. Push back was the right word. I just did not expect it to knock on my door. It was late morning when the bell rang. I was in the living room reading the paper I had barely absorbed when I heard tires crunch on the gravel drive. Through the front window, I saw Adam's car parked straight this time, careful. Another car sat behind it. A gray sedan I did not recognize. I opened the door before they knocked again. Adam stood there with his hands folded, shoulders slightly forward, the way he used to stand when he was about to ask for something. Natalie was beside him, composed as always, her hair neat, her expression arranged. A man in a navy suit stood half a step back, holding a leather folder against his chest. "Rick," Natalie said, "thank you for seeing us. I did not invite them in right away." I looked at the man. "This is Mr. Howard," Natalie said. "He is an attorney. We just want to talk." Talk was a word doing a lot of work. I stepped aside and let them in. They sat at the dining table. The attorney remained standing until I gestured for him to take a chair. He did, placing his folder on the table but not opening it yet. Adam spoke first. He said they were concerned. He said they wanted to make sure I was okay. He said recent changes had raised some questions. Natalie picked up smoothly. She said they had noticed I seemed withdrawn. She said decisions made in isolation can sometimes lead to regret. She said families should look out for one another, especially as parents get older. I felt something settle behind my ribs, solid and cold. I kept my voice level. I asked what they were concerned about. The attorney finally spoke. He introduced himself, again polite, professional. He said his role was simply to make sure everyone understood their options. He said sometimes families explore additional support to ensure safety and well-being. Safety, well-being. Adam nodded as if these were reasonable things to worry about. He avoided my eyes. I asked them directly if they thought I was incapable of managing my own affairs. Natalie smiled, small and careful. "No one is saying that," she said. "We just want to be proactive." Proactive was another word doing more work than it should. I told them I was healthy. I told them I paid my bills on time. I told them I had not missed a doctor's appointment or a mortgage payment in my life. I asked what exactly they wanted. The attorney opened his folder part way, not enough for me to see much. He said there were legal tools families sometimes use to help manage finances and decisions. He mentioned powers of attorney. He mentioned oversight. He said these arrangements could be temporary. Temporary. I thought of Mary at the bank. I thought of the inquiries. I thought of how close I had come to signing something without reading it. I told them I was not interested. Natalie's expression tightened just for a moment. She said they were surprised by my resistance. She said it made them worry more, not less. She said refusing help can be a sign of declining judgment. That was when I understood the shape of the conversation. Every answer I gave could be written down and used later. Calm became denial. Firm became stubbornness. No became evidence. I stood up and said the meeting was over. Adam looked panicked. He said we were just talking. He said I did not have to be defensive. I told him I was not defensive. I was done. They left without raising their voices. The attorney shook my hand like nothing unusual had happened. Natalie said she hoped I would think about what they discussed. Adam said he would call me later. He did not. 2 days later, another knock came. This one was lighter, measured. A woman stood on my porch holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as Janet Collins from County Social Services. She said she was there for a routine wellness check. Routine was becoming a theme. I invited her in. She sat across from me, polite, observant. She asked about my health, my medications, my daily routine. She asked if I had trouble remembering things. She asked if anyone helped me manage my money. I answered calmly. I told her the truth. I told her I lived alone. I told her I drove myself. I told her I handled my own finances. I told her I had no difficulty understanding what I was asked. She nodded and wrote things down. Every nod felt like a small verdict. She asked if there had been recent conflict in my family. I said yes. She asked if I felt pressured. I said I felt observed. She looked up at that. Not surprised. Interested. She explained the process carefully. She said wellness checks were meant to ensure safety, not punish independence. She said reports were made, files opened, notes kept. She said sometimes families confuse concern with control. I asked her if I was in trouble. She said not at the moment. She said my answers were clear and consistent. She said clarity mattered. When she left, she handed me a card. She said if anything changed, I should call. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The house felt smaller again, but not weak, alert. It took me a few minutes to name what I was feeling. Fear, yes, but also something sharper, recognition. This was not about love or concern. This was about leverage. Money had been the first tool. When that failed, paperwork followed. When paperwork stalled, procedure arrived. Family, when mixed with entitlement, could be more dangerous than strangers. Strangers needed permission to cross lines. Family often assumed it. I went to my desk and pulled out a notebook. I wrote down dates, names, what was said, who was present, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted a record, because I wanted ground under my feet. I thought of my father again, his steady hands, his quiet rules. A man stands on his own feet even when someone is willing to lift him. I understood him better now. I was not fighting my son. I was defending myself. There was a difference, and it mattered. As the sun dipped lower, I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like resolve. I needed help. Not the kind that took control, the kind that protected it. And I was done waiting to see how far they would go. I did not wait for courage to show up. I acted while I still had enough calm to think straight. The next morning, I called the number on the business card Mary had given me at the bank. She had written a name on the back in neat handwriting. David Klein, attorney. She told me he handled cases involving older adults and financial pressure, the kind families don't like to call pressure until it's too late. His office was in a plain brick building on the north side of Columbus, tucked between a dental clinic and a small accounting firm. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner. There were framed certificates on the wall and a few pamphlets in a rack about estate planning and guardianship. I sat down and tried to keep my breathing steady. A receptionist asked me to fill out a short form. Name, address, emergency contact. I almost wrote Adam's name out of habit, then stopped. My pen hovered, then I wrote Margaret instead. It was a small thing, but it felt like a line drawn in ink. David Klein came out a few minutes later. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that looked lived in rather than flashy. He shook my hand and called me Mr. Holloway. I corrected him, and he apologized with a quick smile, the kind that doesn't waste time. In his office, he asked me to tell him what happened. I started with the wedding. That still felt like the first betrayal, even if the paperwork came later. I told him about Natalie's words, about the transfer I canceled, about the attorney at my dining table, about the wellness check. I told him about Mary's warning at the bank, the inquiries, the careful wording. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and nodded once. He said I was not the first man to sit in that chair with a story like mine. He did not say it with pity. He said it like a mechanic recognizing a familiar sound in an engine. He said the pattern was common. First, money. When money stops, the story changes. Concern replaces gratitude. Safety replaces love. Then comes the paperwork. He told me the truth in plain language. He said adults have the right to spend their money how they want, even if their family disagrees. He said the danger comes when someone tries to make you look incapable so they can step in legally. Guardianship, he explained, is supposed to protect people who truly cannot protect themselves, but it can be used as a weapon when someone wants access. I asked him how far something like that could go. David did not soften it. He said, if a court believes you are impaired, you can lose control of your finances. You can lose control of where you live. You can lose the right to make medical decisions. And once you are labeled in that way, it is hard to climb back out, even if you are perfectly fine. He asked if I had signed anything. I told him no. He nodded, then asked if anyone had tried. I hesitated, then told him about the paper Natalie once slid across my table weeks ago, the one she called a simple form, the one I had nearly signed before I felt something was off. I told him I had pushed it back and said I wanted to read it, and how she had laughed like I was being overly serious. David's eyes narrowed slightly. He said that instinct probably saved me. He asked me to start documenting everything. Dates, names, what was said, who was present. He said courts respect records more than feelings. He said I should update my beneficiary designations, lock down my accounts, and avoid signing anything handed to me by family without counsel. He said if anyone showed up again with a lawyer, I should not argue. I should say I would communicate through my attorney. I walked out of his office feeling both steadier and more unsettled. Steadier because I finally understood the terrain. Unsettled because I realized how quickly a quiet life can be rewritten by someone else's narrative. On the way home, I ran into Ron Becker outside, leaning over the hood of his truck, with a rag in his hand. Ron lived 2 houses down. He was retired law enforcement, the kind of man who still woke up early because his body did not know any other way. He watched me pull into my driveway and waited until I got out. "You look like you just left a funeral," he said. I told him I had met with an attorney. Ron did not ask for details right away. He just nodded once like he was glad to hear I was taking it seriously. Then he asked who the attorney was, and when I told him, he nodded again. "Good," Ron said. "That man does not sugarcoat things." I leaned against my car and told Ron the short version. He listened with his arms crossed, face still, eyes sharp. When I finished, he let out a breath. "I have seen it," he said. "More than you would think. A parent gets older, a kid gets desperate, and suddenly concern becomes a tool. They don't even think of it as stealing. They think of it as claiming what they deserve." I asked him what people do when it happens. Ron looked at my house, then back at me. "They freeze," he said. "They get embarrassed. They try to keep it quiet. They don't want neighbors to know. That is how it gets worse." That afternoon, I went to the community center, where I occasionally played cards with a few retirees. Harold Simmons was there, sitting at a table with a newspaper folded beside his coffee. Harold used to be a teacher. He carried himself like one calm voice, steady gaze, the kind of man who can say something hard without raising his volume. He asked how I was, and I surprised myself by telling him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Harold listened, then said something that landed like a simple truth you cannot argue with. Love does not require a monthly transfer, he said. Respect should not be rented. I stared at him, and for a moment, I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. 2 days later, Adam texted me asking if he could stop by. He said he just wanted to talk. The word just made me wary. Still, I agreed because part of me still wanted my son to be my son. He arrived alone, no Natalie, no attorney. He looked tired. He sat at the dining table, like he used to when he was younger. Shoulders slightly hunched, he was moving around the room as if searching for permission. He said he was sorry things felt tense. He said Natalie was stressed. He said money had been tight. He said they did not mean to hurt me. I asked him why I was not invited to the wedding. He swallowed. He said it happened fast. He said Natalie wanted it small. He said it did not feel like a big deal in the moment. I asked him if I was not a big deal. He looked down at his hands. He did not answer. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He placed it in front of me and slid it across the table with 2 fingers like it was nothing. He said Natalie wanted me to sign it so they could help manage some things just in case. He said it was only for convenience. He said it would make everyone feel better. I did not touch it. I felt my stomach tighten, not with fear this time, but with recognition. The phrasing was different, but the intent was the same. Convenience, safety, helping. I asked him what it was. He said it was a form. He said it was simple. I looked at the line where my signature would go. I did not need to read every word to know that signing it would be a doorway. Once opened, it would not be mine to close. I pushed the paper back toward him. I told him I was not signing anything. He blinked, surprised, like he had expected my old version to show up, the father who would say yes, because saying no felt like abandonment. He asked why I was making it so hard. I took a slow breath and told him I was not making it hard. I was making it clear. I told him I loved him. I told him I wanted him to be okay, but I told him my life was not something they could manage to feel better about their own. Adam's jaw tightened. He stood up quickly, chair scraping the floor. He said he was just trying to help. He said I was overreacting. Then he grabbed the paper, folded it once, and shoved it back into his pocket. At the door, he turned and looked at me, eyes wet but stubborn. He said he did not recognize me lately. I did not answer right away. I watched him walk down the driveway and drive away, the sound of his engine fading into the afternoon. When the house went quiet again, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. I might lose my relationship with my son, at least the version of it I had carried in my head for years. But I could not lose myself trying to keep him. And for the first time since the phone call that started all of this, the thought did not feel like grief. It felt like a decision. I sat at the kitchen table long after Adam left, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off, as if the house was trying to remind me it still had a job to do. The next morning, I called David Klein and told him what happened. I told him Adam brought a paper. I told him I did not sign. David did not sound surprised. He asked me to email a photo of it if I had one. I said I did not. Adam took it with him. David said it did not matter. He said the attempt was the point. He said it meant they were building a story, and stories like that often end up in a courtroom if you do not prepare. 2 weeks later, a deputy delivered an envelope to my front door. It was not dramatic. No sirens, no raised voices. Just a man in a brown uniform asking me to sign for a document and telling me to have a good day. Inside was a notice of petition filed in Franklin County Probate Court. Someone was asking the court to appoint a guardian for my estate and decision-making based on concerns about my judgment and vulnerability. The word guardian looked clean on paper, almost caring. The meaning beneath it was not. I called David immediately. He told me to breathe. He told me not to call Adam. He told me not to text Natalie. He said anything I said in anger could be turned into proof of instability. He said we would respond through the proper channels and request a hearing. The week leading up to it felt like walking through my own life with someone else holding the pen. Every time I forgot where I left my keys, I wondered if that would be used against me. Every time I felt tired, I wondered if someone would call it decline. I kept thinking of Janet Collins with her clipboard of how easily a calm conversation becomes a file. David had me gather records, doctor visits, medication lists, proof of bills paid, bank statements showing I managed my own affairs, a short letter from my primary care physician confirming I was competent and independent. It was humiliating in a quiet way, like having to prove you were yourself. The morning of the hearing, I wore my suit, the same one I had zipped shut in the closet when I realized I was not invited to Adam's wedding. It still fit, though it felt different on my shoulders now. Less like celebration and more like armor. The courthouse in downtown Columbus was the kind of building that makes you lower your voice without being asked. Stone walls, metal detectors, signs that tell you what you cannot bring inside, people sitting in hard chairs holding folders like life preservers. David met me near the security line. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye. He told me to answer only what was asked. He told me to stay calm. He said this was not a place for speeches. It was a place for clarity. We sat on one side of the hallway outside the courtroom. Across from us, Adam and Natalie sat with their attorney. I recognized him. Mr. Howard, the man from my dining table. He was talking softly to Natalie while she nodded, composed, as if this was a meeting she had scheduled and not a public attempt to take control of her husband's father. Adam sat slightly apart, shoulders hunched. His eyes moved everywhere but toward me. When the bailiff called our case, we walked into a small courtroom that felt too ordinary for something this personal. A judge in a black robe sat at the bench, not stern, not warm, just present. A clerk typed quietly. A court reporter prepared her machine. It was all business. That was the unsettling part. This was my life reduced to procedure. The judge began with the basics. Names, relationships, purpose of the petition. Mr. Howard spoke first. He used careful language. He said my family was concerned about recent decisions. He said I had become isolated. He said I had made abrupt financial changes. He said there were worries I could be taken advantage of, including by myself, as if that phrase made sense. Then Natalie testified. She sat straight in the witness chair and spoke with controlled sympathy. She said she loved me. She said she wanted me safe. She said I had been forgetting things. She said I was increasingly suspicious. She said I stopped supporting them without warning, and that it seemed irrational given how close we all were. Close. There was that word again, now dressed up for a courtroom. The judge asked her to give examples. Natalie gave a few, but they were thin. Misplaced keys, a missed phone call, me asking questions about my bank. She framed every normal thing an older man does as a sign of trouble. Then she said something that did not sound like concern. It sounded like entitlement. She said she worried my assets would be mismanaged if I continued making decisions alone, especially since I had always intended to help family, and now was refusing to do so. The judge looked up from her notes. She asked Natalie to clarify what she meant by assets. Natalie spoke a little too quickly then, like she was trying to get ahead of a thought. She mentioned my retirement accounts, the paid-off house, the savings I had built with Claire. She said it would be safer for everyone if there was oversight to protect me from impulsive decisions. David stood and objected politely, asking the judge to note that Natalie was discussing my finances in detail without demonstrating incapacity. The judge nodded and told Natalie to keep her answers focused. Adam was called next. He walked to the witness chair, slowly, eyes down. When he sat, he folded his hands like a kid waiting for a principal. Mr. Howard asked him if he believed I was capable of managing my own affairs. Adam hesitated. He glanced at Natalie, then at Mr. Howard, then finally toward me. His eyes dropped again. He said he did not know. He said lately I seemed different. He said I was distant. He said he worried. The judge asked him to look at me and answer directly. She said this was his father and the court needed clarity, not impressions. Adam looked at me then briefly. I saw something in his face that hurt more than anger would have. Confusion. Shame. A desire to be anywhere else. He said he did not want to fight. He said he wanted peace. The judge asked him if I had ever missed paying my bills. Adam said no. The judge asked if I drove safely. Adam said yes. The judge asked if I had ever been diagnosed with dementia or cognitive impairment. Adam said not that he knew of. The judge asked why the petition was filed now. Adam swallowed. He said because things had gotten tense. He said Natalie thought it was necessary. That was the moment that made everything clear. Not because it was shocking, but because it was honest in the way people are honest when they are cornered. Adam was not the driver. He was the passenger. Then it was my turn. David guided me with simple questions. My age, my work history, my daily routine, who I listed as emergency contact, who helped me manage my finances. I answered calmly. I said I lived alone and managed my own affairs. I said I cooked, drove, handled appointments, paid bills. I said I had spoken with my bank and my physician. I said I had no intention of giving anyone control over my finances or decisions. The judge asked why I stopped providing financial support to my son. I took a slow breath. I did not mention the wedding. Not yet. I said support should be voluntary, not expected. I said my son was an adult. I said I had the right to adjust my budget without being declared incompetent. The judge leaned back slightly and looked at the file again. Then she asked a question that felt like it landed in the center of the room. She asked Natalie if the family had discussed alternatives to guardianship like setting boundaries, counseling, or financial planning before coming to court. Natalie answered, but her tone shifted. She said they tried. She said I refused. She said I was stubborn. She said this was the only option. The judge's face did not change, but something in her eyes hardened just a fraction. She said guardianship was an extreme measure. She said the court required clear evidence of incapacity, not family disagreement. After a short recess, the judge returned with her decision. She denied the request for guardianship. She stated there was insufficient evidence that I was unable to manage my affairs. She reminded both sides that adults have the right to control their finances and make choices others may not like. She encouraged clear boundaries and recommended that any future communication be done respectfully and preferably through counsel if conflict continued. I expected to feel relief. I did, but it was thin. Natalie kept her expression composed as the judge spoke, but her jaw tightened. Adam stared at the floor. When it ended, neither of them looked at me. Outside the courtroom, David placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. He said we did well. He said we protected what mattered. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. In the hallway, Adam walked past me without stopping. Natalie followed, already speaking quietly to Mr. Howard about next steps, as if this was merely a setback in a plan. I stood there for a moment, listening to footsteps echo off stone, and I realized something that should have been obvious. I had won the right to remain myself. But I had lost something else in the process, something I was not sure a court could ever give back. When I stepped outside into the cold daylight, the city noise felt distant. Cars moved, people crossed the street. Life kept going. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward my car, wondering what a father is supposed to do when the truth is no longer a mystery, and the only question left is what it will cost to live with it. The months that followed did not arrive with drama. They arrived quietly, one ordinary morning at a time. Winter loosened its grip, the days stretched a little longer, and I realized I was still standing. Not triumphant, not defeated, just standing. I sold the house in the spring, not out of bitterness, not because anyone forced me. It was simply too big for one man who had learned how much silence a room can hold. I moved into a smaller place on the edge of town, a single story, with a narrow porch and a maple tree that dropped its leaves early. The neighbors nodded when they passed. No one asked questions. I liked that. I kept my routines simple. Coffee in the morning, a walk after breakfast, reading in the afternoon light that fell just right across the living room floor. I fixed small things when they broke. I learned where the best bread was baked and which cashier remembered names. The days felt lighter, not because nothing hurt, but because nothing was pulling at me anymore. Once a week, I drove to a community center downtown and volunteered with a group that helped older adults navigate financial abuse. The work was quiet and careful, mostly listening, helping people fill out forms, making phone calls they were afraid to make alone. I never told my whole story. I did not need to. When someone sat across from me and said they felt foolish for trusting their own family, I knew what to say. You are not foolish. You are human. The men and women there did not need saving. They needed clarity, so had I. I heard less and less from Adam. That did not surprise me. Distance has a way of settling into whatever space you give it. Sometimes it grows. Sometimes it stays exactly where it is. I stopped checking my phone as often. I stopped wondering what each silence meant. One evening in late summer, my phone buzzed while I was washing dishes. I dried my hands and looked at the screen. It was a message from Adam. He said he hoped I was doing well. He said work had been busy. He said he was thinking about me. That was all. No apology, no request, no explanation. Just a few words, carefully chosen like stones placed across a stream without committing to a crossing. I read the message once, then again. I felt the familiar pull, the old reflex to fill the gap, to make it easier to respond quickly so the moment would not slip away. Then I set the phone down on the counter and finished the dishes. I did not ignore him. I simply did not rush. Somewhere along the way, I had learned that responding immediately was something I used to do when I was afraid of being forgotten. I was not afraid anymore. I would answer when I was ready, or I would not. Either way, the choice was mine. I thought about Natalie sometimes less with anger and more with distance. Control wears many masks. It often believes itself to be concern. I hoped for Adam's sake that he would someday recognize the difference. But I no longer felt responsible for teaching him that lesson. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not the same as reconciliation. You can let go of resentment without reopening a door. You can wish someone well without placing yourself back within reach. On quiet mornings, I sat on the porch and listened to the neighborhood wake up. A dog barking down the street, a car starting, wind moving through the maple leaves. Life did not need my permission to go on, and that was comforting. I thought back to the courtroom, to the moment the judge spoke and the room exhaled. I remembered the hollow feeling that followed the understanding that some things had been preserved and others had been lost. That feeling had softened with time, not disappeared. Softened. What remained was something steadier. I knew who I was without anyone else defining it. I was a man who paid his bills, kept his word, and chose his boundaries carefully. I was a father who loved his son without confusing love with surrender. I was a widower who carried his past without letting it dictate every step forward. I did not win. I did not lose. I learned. On one particular morning, early and clear, I stood at the window with a cup of coffee and watched the sun reach across the yard. The light settled on the porch railing and warmed my hands. I thought about the version of myself who once believed that silence had to be filled, that love had to be proven with sacrifice, that saying no would cost me everything. I wished I could tell that man one simple thing. Some silences are not punishments. They are space, and space is where you find out who you are. If you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, maybe you have stood in a quiet room wondering when you became optional. Maybe you have given without keeping score and woken up one day realizing the cost was more than money. I cannot tell you what choice to make. I can only ask you a question that changed my life. What are you still paying for that no longer honors who you are? The morning moved on. I took another sip of coffee, set the cup down, and stepped into the day that belonged to me.